She was only 7 years old, small hands pressed to her stomach, voice trembling as she whispered into the receiver, "Please, help me. My daddy and his friend made me sick." At first, it could have been dismissed as a child's stomach ache, but in Cedar Falls, that fragile plea would unravel a nightmare no one ever imagined hiding behind white fences and yellow houses. There was the grieving father who walked the streets with hollow eyes. There was the family friend, trusted by all, whose smile masked something unspeakable. And there was Ranger, the German shepherd, whose instincts refused to let the truth stay buried. When Officer Michael Turner pulled his cruiser up beside the house, sunlight still slanted across the neat picket fences. Church bells long since faded into the quiet air. Cedar Falls looked peaceful, almost frozen in time. A town where people still waved at strangers and gossip carried faster over diner counters than the morning paper. But on the far edge of town, inside a windowless room glowing with green monitors and radio static, everything was about to change. Angela Ruiz sat at her console in the Emergency Communication Center. At 49, she carried the kind of calm born from hearing everything: the crashes, the sobs, and the calls that never found words. She was a sturdy woman of average height, dark hair streaked with gray pulled back in a bun. Her olive skin caught the faint light of the screens. Her brown eyes were both soft and unyielding, like a mother who could cradle or command in the same breath. Her colleagues said Angela carried gravity. She didn't waste time with jokes during shift. Every call, she believed, was someone's worst day. Her own life had taught her that. At 20, she lost her younger brother in a car accident. She never forgot the dispatcher's voice that night, steady, clear, a thread of control in the chaos. Perhaps that was why she stayed in this work all these years, to be that voice when the world collapsed for someone else. That afternoon, coffee cooled beside her keyboard as she scrolled through routine updates. Then, the line blinked red. She adjusted her headset and spoke the words she had spoken 1,000 times before. 911. What is your emergency? At first, nothing. Only silence. Then came the faintest sound, cloth rustling, uneven breaths, as if someone were hiding in a closet, holding the phone against their chest. Angela's spine stiffened. And then so soft she almost missed it, the voice of a child, broken, pleading. "Please help me." She froze, pen hovering above the notepad. The voice was no longer muffled. It carried words that made her blood run cold. "My daddy and his friend, they made me sick." For a heartbeat, Angela forgot to breathe. On her screen, the address populated. A yellow house with a white fence. A place she had passed dozens of times without a second thought. But tonight, this house was no longer just part of the scenery of Cedar Falls. Tonight, it was about to rip open a secret so vile, it would change everything. And as Angela dispatched Officer Turner and Ranger toward that address, she had no way of knowing, neither did the town, that behind that little girl's stomach pain was a truth so dark it wouldn't just shatter one family. It would put Cedar Falls itself on trial. "Hello," Angela coaxed. "This is 911. Can you tell me what's wrong?" The reply was almost inaudible. "My tummy hurts." The voice was high and fragile, like porcelain that could break with a breath. Angela leaned forward. "Sweetheart, what's your name?" "Eiley." "Emily Carter," Angela typed quickly. "Female, approximately 7 years old. Caller. Reports abdominal pain. Whispering possible concealment." "Hi, Emily," she said, softening her tone. "I'm Angela. You're very brave for calling. Can you tell me where you are right now?" "In the closet," Emily whispered. "I had to hide. Daddy and Mr. Gregg are in the kitchen. I feel sick." Angela's pulse tightened, though her voice stayed calm. "You're doing wonderfully, Emily. I need your address so we can help you." 22 Maple Street, the yellow house, white fence. Angela's fingers tapped it in. On the map, the neighborhood lit up. A modest line of houses on the east side of town. "Perfect. Emily, I see your house right here. I'm sending someone to help you." Emily was 7, small for her age, with thin arms and long brown hair that tended to fall into her eyes when she got nervous. Freckles dusted her cheeks, a constellation that seemed almost playful when she smiled. But today there was no smile, only a pale face pressed against the dark of a closet. She wore a blue t-shirt with a faded carousel horse, her favorite, because her mother had given it to her before she passed away. She clutched a stuffed bear with one torn ear. Mr. Bear had survived spilled juice, thunderstorms, and lonely nights. He was her guard now. The pain in her stomach had grown sharper since lunch. She remembered the soup chicken broth noodles, but also a strange bitter taste she hadn't liked. Mr. Gregg, her father's friend, had insisted she finish it. Now, curled in the closet, Emily whispered into the phone, "It hurts more when I breathe." Angela wrote another note. Pain worsening. Caller reports suspect. Mr. Gregg prepared food. Angela had taken thousands of calls. She knew the difference between a child exaggerating and a child in danger. Something about the tremor in Emily's voice told her this was no simple stomachache, a child hiding while adults laughed in another room. This was wrong. "Emily," she said gently, "I'm sending an officer who is very kind. His name is Michael, and he has a dog named Ranger who's big but very gentle with kids. They'll be there soon." "Will Ranger find me?" Emily asked. "Yes," Angela whispered. "He's the best at finding people who need help." On the west side of town, Officer Michael Turner adjusted the rear-view mirror of his Ford Interceptor as the dispatch crackled to life. Michael was 41, tall, and broad-shouldered with close-cropped brown hair beginning to gray at the temples. His jaw was square, marked by a faint scar from a training accident years ago. He carried himself with quiet authority, the kind that calmed a room rather than intimidated it. Born and raised in Ohio, Michael had served 10 years as a Marine before joining the police force. He had seen deserts abroad and storms at home. The experiences had chiseled him, made him patient, less quick to anger. Colleagues knew him as a man who listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. The call details appeared on his console. Juvenile female, severe. Abdominal pain. Caller hiding. Possible neglect. Abuse. Address. 22 Maple Street. Michael exhaled slowly. Children's calls always cut deeper. He tapped the crate in the back seat. "Ranger, looks like we've got work." Inside the crate, a head lifted. Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd, gazed out with amber eyes, alert and steady. His coat was the classic black and tan, sleek across powerful shoulders. A small notch marked his left ear, a scar from a dit branch during a winter search. Ranger had been with Michael since he was 2, trained in scent detection, tracking, and protection. Unlike many canines, he had a calm temperament, able to sit patiently beside children without startling them. Yet beneath the calm was a machine of instinct and loyalty. A dog, who would throw himself between danger and his handler without hesitation. Michael sometimes thought Ranger carried emotions better than humans. Where people lied, dogs revealed. Where people hid secrets, dogs smelled truth. Now, Ranger shifted his weight, ears pricking, as if he understood the urgency in the dispatcher's tone. Angela kept Emily talking while Michael sped across town. "Emily, I want you to breathe with me. Can you hold Mr. Bear?" "And count in and out?" Emily whispered. "Okay." Angela could hear the faint rhythm of a child trying to be brave. She pictured the small girl crouched in darkness, clutching a stuffed toy. Memories of her brother surfaced again. The night she wished someone had comforted him before the crash. She resolved not to let this child feel alone. "You are not by yourself, Angela," he promised. "I'm right here until Officer Michael arrives." Michael turned onto Maple Street. The houses looked peaceful. Sun on siding, bikes, and yards. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested danger, but Angela's voice over the radio kept him sharp. "Unit 2K9, Angela said. "Child remains in closet. Reports abdominal pain after consuming soup prepared by father's friend, identified as Greg. Adults believed to be in kitchen. Child fearful." "Copy," Michael replied, checking mirrors. His hand reached back once more, resting on RERS's crate. "Stay ready, partner." The German shepherd's tail thumped once against the metal floor, a steady promise. Michael pulled onto Maple Street, the address glowing on his console, Ranger watching from the back with burning focus. In the communication center, Angela still held the line, guiding Emily through each breath. The pieces were in motion. A frightened little girl in a closet, a dispatcher's calm voice, a seasoned officer, and a loyal dog. What had begun as a stomach ache was now something heavier, something darker, waiting inside that yellow house with the white fence. The patrol car rolled toward number 22, and the story still hidden in shadows was about to begin. The cruiser slowed to a stop in front of 22 Maple Street. To anyone passing by, it was the picture of small-town tranquility, a 2-story home painted the color of buttercream, a tidy white fence running its perimeter, and a front yard scattered with daisies and wildflowers bending in the late summer air. On the porch, the afternoon sun traced shadows across peeling paint and a wind chime that never quite found harmony. Michael stepped out first, his boots crunching on the gravel strip, while Ranger followed, tail held low but firm, ears pitched forward. The German shepherd sniffed the air, posture straight as a soldier's. The house looked ordinary, but Michael knew appearances could be the cruelest masks. The door creaked open, and John Carter stood framed in the doorway. He was in his late 32nd, tall but slouched, his once athletic build softened by months of neglect. A man who had once been handsome, square jaw, sandy blonde hair, blue eyes that might have held warmth now looked drained as though grief had sanded him down. His skin was pale, cheeks hollow, stubble shadowing his chin, as if shaving had slipped off his list of priorities. John had worked construction most of his life, known among co-workers as steady and good with in his hands. But since the death of his wife 2 years ago from breast cancer, something in him had withered. Friends described him as kind but lost. A father trying but often failing to juggle work, bills, and single parenthood. He carried the constant weight of guilt that he wasn't enough for Emily, that his grief turned him inward when she needed him outward. Now, his expression was a mix of confusion and embarrassment as he saw the uniform on the porch. "Officer, is something wrong?" His voice cracked on. The second word, betraying nerves he didn't mean to show. Before Michael could answer, another figure appeared, behind John. Greg Miller stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on John's shoulder as though guiding the scene. Greg was in his mid-42nd, dressed neatly in khakis and a collared shirt, sleeves rolled to reveal tanned forearms. His dark hair, flecked with the faintest gray, was combed back with meticulous care. He carried himself with easy charm, the type of man who smiled quickly, as if the world were perpetually a room to be won over. His face was lean, angular, his nose a touch sharp, his smile quick and controlled. But what made him memorable wasn't his looks, it was his manner. Greg had the gift of words, slipping into conversations with the precision of someone who studied people carefully. He projected warmth almost too much, a salesman's warmth that seemed rehearsed. Those who knew him only casually thought him friendly, trustworthy. But those who spent time with him noticed something else. His eyes never laughed with his mouth. Behind the smile was the calculation. A man who measured outcomes before deciding how much of himself to reveal. "Good evening, officer," Greg said, smoothly, stepping half in front of John. "Is there a problem? We weren't expecting visitors, Michelle and First. Contact." Michael adjusted his stance, calm but firm, Ranger sitting obediently at his heel. "We received a call from this residence. I need to check on everyone inside." John blinked rapidly, taken aback. A call from here must be some mistake. And then the sound broke, the air. From behind the men, a small figure emerged. Emily Carter stepped into view. She wore her carousel t-shirt, now wrinkled, and clutched her stuffed bear tight against her chest. Her brown hair was tangled, cheeks pale, and her body hunched slightly as if folding around the ache in her stomach. Her eyes lifted to Michael's uniform with a flicker of relief, but then quickly darted toward Greg, and all the light in her expression vanished. She hugged Mr. Bear tighter, avoiding his gaze. "Emily," John said, soft but distracted as if embarrassed. "Go lie down, honey. The officer just stopped by, that's all." But Emily didn't move. She lingered near the doorway, shoulders trembling, gaze fixed on the ground. Ranger's body tensed. His amber eyes followed Greg, and a low growl slipped from his throat. Quiet but unmistakable. Michael felt the vibration through the leash, the dog's instincts were speaking, a warning, a sign that something about Greg smelled wrong. Greg's smile faltered only for a fraction of a second before he crouched slightly, hand extended toward the dog. "Ah, the famous Ranger. I've always loved dogs," he said, voice light, controlled. But Ranger didn't move closer. His growl deepened, ears stiff, nose twitching as though cataloging a scent he didn't trust. Michael gave the leash a subtle correction, calming his partner, but keeping his eyes fixed on Greg. Michael bent slightly, lowering himself to Emily's eye level. His voice softened. "Hi, Emily. I'm Officer Turner. I heard you weren't feeling well." Emily clutched Mr. Bear tighter, lips parting as though to speak, but Greg's shadow loomed in her peripheral vision. She swallowed the words and nodded instead, eyes darting away. Michael didn't press her. Instead, he turned his focus back to John. "Sir, I'll need to come in and check just to make sure everyone's safe." John hesitated, running a hand through his unkempt hair, eyes flickering toward Greg as though waiting for permission. The smallest pause, but Michael caught it. Greg stepped forward again, his charm sliding back into place. "Of course, officer, we have nothing to hide. Please come in. You'll see everything is perfectly fine." Michael didn't answer immediately. He studied the man's too eager smile, the way Emily shrank behind her stuffed bear, and the steady, unblinking focus of Ranger at his side. And in that quiet tension, in the seemingly perfect home, with the white fence and summer flowers, the first cracks in the facade began to show. Michael stepped inside, his boots clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, mixed with something heavier, an undercurrent of spice and bitterness that didn't belong in a family home. The air carried the residue of cooked broth, still lingering like a ghost around the kitchen door. Ranger stayed close at his side, leash-taw, amber eyes scanning every corner. The kitchen revealed itself in tidy order. A round oak table sat near the window, set with mismatched placemats and a vase of fading daisies. On the counter, a pot, still steamed faintly, the broth scent curling into the room. Yet what caught Michael's trained eye wasn't the surface cleanliness, but the subtle disorder. Spoons left slightly askew, and a cabinet door closed too quickly when they entered. John Carter hovered awkwardly near the fridge, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. His tall frame seemed diminished in the bright kitchen light, shoulders slumped as though the weight of the house pressed only on him. His shirt, plaid and untucked, carried faint stains from past meals, and his boots scuffed the floor in restless patterns. He tried to appear casual, but his eyes kept darting toward Michael, then to Greg, and then quickly away again. Greg Miller, in contrast, seemed perfectly at ease. He moved with a practiced smoothness, stepping lightly onto the tiled floor as though it were his stage. His collared shirt was still crisp, his hair in immaculate place, and his smile never faltered. "You'll see, officer," he said warmly, gesturing toward the pot. "Just a bit of chicken. Soup. Comfort food. Poor Emily's been anxious lately. Children often imagine their aches into something bigger, don't they?" Before Michael could answer, Ranger padded forward, nose low, tracing invisible trails across the floor. The shepherd circled the table once, then returned to the counter. His ears flicked sharply, his body stiffening as he sniffed the lower cabinets. A low, warning bark escaped him, a bark that wasn't loud but carried authority, a signal that something was wrong. Michael crouched, opening the cabinet door Ranger had indicated. Inside, among ordinary cans of beans and pasta boxes, a small collection of bottles huddled in the far corner. Their labels had been peeled away, leaving only bare amber, glass and white caps. Michael lifted one, holding it up to the light. The liquid inside was faintly yellow, too viscous for anything innocent. John's face flushed, and he stepped forward as if to explain, but the words tangled before leaving his mouth. His lips parted, closed again, and his gaze dropped to the floor. Emily stood in the doorway, clutching her stuffed bear, eyes wide. She looked small against the tall frame of the door, hair still tangled, cheeks pale, her fingers twisted at the bear's ear, nervous and fragile. When Michael turned his attention gently to her, his voice softened. "Emily," he said, "can you tell me when your stomach started to hurt?" The girl bit her lip, then whispered so faintly he had to lean closer to hear. "After the soup, the one Mr. Gregg made." Her words trembled like a secret, dragged reluctantly into the light. Greg's smile snapped back into place instantly, his tone airy and dismissive. "Oh, children, officer, they need to say the funniest things when they're upset. She probably ate too quickly. Or maybe it's all the candy she sneaks when no one's looking. Isn't that right, Emily?" He gave a chuckle meant to sound affectionate, but it rang hollow, and Emily's eyes dropped to the floor again. Her small shoulders hunched tighter, as though she were trying to make herself disappear. Michael studied the room, studied the man, and studied the child. He'd been trained to notice the fractures between words and truth, and here they spread like spiderweb cracks and glass. Emily's body language, the hesitant tremor in her voice, the way she shrank under Greg's gaze, all of it rang with sincerity. And then there was Ranger, hackles raised, nose pressed toward the bottles, the low growl vibrating deep in his chest. Michael straightened, holding the bottle lightly in one hand, meeting Greg's gaze without flinching. "Children don't always imagine things," he said quietly. "Sometimes they're the only ones telling the truth." For the first time, Greg's smile flickered, thin as paper stretched too far. His eyes, dark and sharp, narrowed, almost imperceptibly, before widening again into fine warmth. But the damage was done. The kitchen's perfect mask had begun to peel. The ride to Cedar Falls General Hospital was a blur of flashing lights and muted sirens. Michael kept his cruiser steady, eyes sharp on the road. Beside him, John Carter sat twisted in the passenger seat, his hands knotted in his hair, murmuring apologies under his breath. In the back, Emily lay, stretched across the seat, her small frame dwarfed by the sterile blanket paramedics had wrapped around her. She clutched Mr. Bear against her chest, eyelids fluttering as though the world weighed too heavily on them. Ranger sat on the floorboard, alert but calm, his steady presence filling the small space like a promise. The dog's eyes flicked, off and toward Emily, nose twitching, as though keeping inventory of every shallow breath she took. When they arrived, hospital staff moved quickly. Nurse Linda McCarthy, a woman in her 50s, with cropped silver hair and a frame made wiry by decades of lifting more than her share of patients, guided Emily onto a gurney. Linda had a voice like gravel, softened by honey, rough but kind. Her scrubs were patterned with sunflowers, a cheerful contrast to the serious line of her mouth. "Let's get nibbling her inside," Linda said, snapping her fingers for the orderly to push. "She's pale as paper. Vitals now." Michael and Ranger stayed just outside the sliding doors while John followed, still pale and shaking. Greg was the last to enter. His stride measured, his shirt still perfectly pressed. He looked like a man attending a meeting, not a crisis. Inside the exam room, Dr. Samuel Whitaker took over. In his early 62nd, Whitaker was tall and lean, his frame draped in a white coat that had seen decades of stains and hurried scrubbings. His hair was a cloud of gray, his jaw sharp but softened by age, and his eyes a pale blue that seemed to hold both weariness and steel. He'd spent 30 years in emergency medicine, and his face carried the map of that life, deep lines etched by midnight shifts, loss, and the weight of decisions that never felt simple. Dr. Whitaker examined Emily quickly, his hands sure and efficient. "Pulse is weak," he murmured to Linda. "Abdominal tenderness. She's dehydrated." He adjusted his glasses and peered at her. "Pupils. What didn't she eat before this started?" Michael answered, his voice steady. "Soup prepared by her father's friend." Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "Anyone else eat the same meal?" "Her father," Michael said, "but no symptoms yet." The doctor gave a sharp nod. "Get blood drawn. Run a talk screen. I want stomach contents analyzed if we can get a sample." He leaned back, eyes cutting, briefly to John, who stood wringing his hands at the foot of the bed. "What exactly was in this soup?" Whitaker asked. John stammered voice. Just chicken noodles. I don't know. Greg said he'd cook for us, I thought." His words trailed off into silence, swallowed by shame. Greg stepped forward smoothly, folding his arms as though he were the calm anchor in a room full of storms. "Doctor, I assure you this is likely nothing serious. Children get upset stomachs all the time. Emily's had been under stress since her mother passed." He paused dramatically, as though offering the tragedy as a shield. "And perhaps she picked something off the ground earlier. You know how children are always curious." Whitaker's eyes lingered on him for a long second, measuring. Then he turned away. "I'll let the test tell me what this island I don't diagnose on excuses." Emily stirred faintly, murmuring. "It burned after the soup." Her small voice cracked the air like glass. Whitaker looked down at her, his expression softening. "Don't worry, young lady. We're going to take care of you." While the doctors moved, Michael crouched beside Ranger and slipped a hand beneath the dog's harness. "We need to be sure," he whispered. An officer, who had followed them inside, produced Greg's leather satchel, retrieved from the waiting area where he'd set it down. Michael knelt, unzipped the bag, and gestured to Ranger. The German shepherd's nose pressed deep inside. He inhaled, paused, then jolted back with a sudden growl that rattled the tiled walls. His hackles rose like a dark tide, teeth bared in instinctive warning. He shoved his muzzle back into the satchel, pawing furiously at the inner pocket, barking sharply now. Inside lay a small vial, identical in shape to those found in the kitchen, a cabinet. Its label had also been peeled away. John staggered back, eyes widening. "Greg, what the hell is that?" Greg's composure held, but only barely. He gave a short laugh, one note too sharp. "Vitamins, just supplements. I travel often. I carry things without labels. It's easier." Michael's gaze locked onto him, cool and unblinking. Funny thing. About supplements. Dogs can't be fooled by excuses. The talk screen came back, faster than usual, pushed ahead by Whitaker's insistence. The results were clear. Traces of opioid-based painkillers in Emily's system, enough to cause severe abdominal distress, dizziness, and worse if left untreated. Whitaker slapped the chart closed. This is no stomach bug. She's ingested something she should never have touched. His voice was iron. This was in her food. The room fell silent. John swayed, on his feet, gripping the bed rail like it might anchor him to reality. No. She wouldn't tag. Greg, tell them. Tell them you didn't tag. Greg lifted his hands, palms, outward, as though innocence could be worn like clothing. John, please. I'd never heard Emily. Maybe she picked up some pills left around the house. You know, children. But Rears's growl drowned out the words. The dog stood rigid, amber eyes locked on Greg, tail stiff, like a drawn sword. The sound wasn't loud, but it was relentless, a warning that vibrated in the bones of everyone who heard it. Michael rose slowly, the satchel and vials still in his hands. You haven't studied Greg's controlled posture, the two polished lines of his shirt, the smile that now looked more like a mask, sliding out of place. Children don't usually lie about pain, Michael said, evenly. And my partner doesn't lie about sense. The story you're spinning doesn't cover either. Greg's jaw tightened, the first crack in his facade. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the beeping of Emily's monitor filling the silence. John collapsed into the visitor's chair, burying his face in his hands. His sobs were muffled, broken, by words no one could quite understand. Dr. Whitaker gave Michael a pointed glance, the kind that carried decades of trust in instincts rather than appearances. You've got something bigger here than just a sick child, the doctor muttered. Michael's hand found Ranger's harness once more. The shepherd pressed closer, steady, ready. The questions around Greg, Miller no longer whispered. They screamed. The night after Emily was admitted, Cedar Falls slept under the low hum of cicadas and the faint glow of porch lights. But inside the police station, the air was heavy with unease. Officer Michael Turner sat at his desk, a cup of black coffee cooling by his elbow. Ranger rested at his feet, the shepherd's chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, though his amber eyes stayed alert, as if he sensed the tension around his handler. Michael had spent hours combing through records. Greg Miller's name appeared too often in too many places to be coincidence. Driver's licenses, rental agreements, temporary jobs in different states. Oklahoma, Kentucky, Illinois, and now Ohio. Every trail ended the same way. Families fractured, single parents left behind, children who vanished without explanation. The files were like ghosts, lined up in digital folders, whispering of patterns that no one else had pieced together. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was broken by the arrival of Detective Sarah Langford, one of the senior investigators at the Cedar Falls Police Department. Sarah was in her mid-42nd, tall and lean, with straight auburn hair that fell just past her shoulders. Years of field work had left her with skin, sun, and a few faint scars on her forearms, mementos of mistakes and close calls. She had sharp hazel eyes, the kind that lingered too long when she was sizing someone up. She was known for her persistence, a woman who hated loose ends. Colleagues respected her grit, but often whispered about her bluntness. Sarah had lost her younger sister to abduction when she was only 17, a case that was never solved. That tragedy carved steel into her character, and now she chased predators with a ferocity that sometimes unsettled even her peers. She dropped a file onto Michael's desk and crossed her arms. You were right to pull background on Miller. I reached out to contacts in other jurisdictions. He's a drifter, changing towns every couple of years, and wherever he goes, something ugly follows. Michael flipped the file open. Inside were copies of missing child posters, faces of boys and girls from different states. One from Louisville, Kentucky, another from Springfield, Illinois. Each case unsolved. Always. Families with no mother, Sarah continued. Widowers, divorcees, single parents, vulnerable homes. He inserts himself as a helper, a friend, and then children disappear. Michael looked down at Ranger. The dog shifted, a low sound in his throat, as if even he could smell the rot buried in those pages. At the hospital, Emily had begun to regain some of her strength. She lay propped against pillows, tubes delivering fluids to her veins. Her cheeks still carried the pour of illness, but her eyes held more clarity now. Michael visited, pulling up, a chair beside her. Ranger sat close, his great head resting on the edge of her bed. Emily stroked his fur absently, comforted by his steady warmth. She glanced around the room nervously before leaning closer to Michael. Her voice was a hush meant for him alone. "I heard him once, Mr. Gregg. He told my daddy, some responsibilities are too heavy for one man." Her small hands twisted the ear of her stuffed bear. "I think he meant me, that I was too heavy, that daddy shouldn't have to keep me." Michael's heart tightened. He spoke gently, his words slow and steady. "Emily, you are never a burden. Do you understand me? Not to me. Not to anyone who loves you." The girl nodded faintly, though the doubt in her eyes lingered. Ranger shifted closer, pressing against her hand as if offering silent proof of Michael's promise. Later that evening, Michael and Sarah obtained a warrant to search John Carter's property more thoroughly. They moved quietly through the house, every creak of the wooden floor carrying suspicion. John followed, anxiously, apologizing repeatedly, his tall frame hunched as though he were trying to make himself smaller. The garage smelled of oil and dust, the kind of space where tools went missing and bicycles rusted from disuse. Ranger padded forward, nose low, circling the concrete floor. His nails clicked softly against the ground. Then he stopped, ears pricked, tail stiff. His body froze like a statue before he began pawing furiously at a section near an old tool cabinet. Michael crouched, running a hand over the area. The faint outline of a box had been pressed into the dust, hidden behind stacked paint cans. He pulled them aside, revealing a metal container with rust lacing its edges. With Sarah's help, he pried it open. Inside lay a collection that chilled the air. Photographs of children neatly stacked, their faces captured in moments of innocence. Birthday parties, school portraits, playground snapshots. Paper folders lay beneath, filled with personal details. Names, birth dates, addresses. Each file corresponded to a child from the missing posters they had reviewed earlier. John's knees buckled when he saw it, his face draining of color. No, I didn't know this was here. I swear to God, I didn't." His voice cracked, desperation spilling out. Sarah's jaw tightened, her hazel eyes burning with a fury that was both professional and personal. She thumbed through the papers with hands that trembled slightly despite her hardened exterior. Michael closed the box gently, his expression carved in stone. "This isn't just about Emily anymore. This is bigger, much bigger." Ranger barked once, sharp and commanding, as if confirming the discovery's weight. His amber eyes glowed in the dim light of the garage, reflecting both triumph and warning. The pieces aligned in Michael's mind like jagged shards of glass. Gregg's charm, his drifting history, the families left broken in his wake, Emily's whispered fears. And now, the box. Concrete proof of predation. Gregg Miller wasn't just a friend overstaying his welcome. He was a predator cloaked in that of faith, respectability, a man feeding on trust. And in Cedar Falls, he had almost succeeded again. Michael rested a hand on RER's head, grounding himself in the dog's steady presence. "We've uncovered his mask," he murmured. "Now we take it off completely." The garage was silent, except for the ticking of an old wall clock and Ranger's steady breathing. The truth had been unearthed, and with it, the shadow of something monstrous. The warrant for Gregg Miller's arrest had been signed. The evidence stacked like bricks too heavy to deny. But by the time officers returned to the Carter home to take him into custody, Gregg was mysterious. Gone. His neat collared shirts and careful grooming habits had disappeared into the night as if he had always planned for this moment. Michael Turner stood on the porch with Detective Sarah Langford beside him, the air heavy with frustration. Ranger shifted restlessly, nose twitching in the direction of the open street. The shepherd's body was taut, every line of him sharpened by instinct. Michael crouched, resting a steadying hand on the dog's shoulder. "Find him," Michael whispered. Ranger lowered his head, drawing in the air. Then, with sudden urgency, he pulled toward the east, leash snapping tight in Michael's hand. Sarah's hazel eyes flicked toward Michael, her jaw tense. "If anyone can track him, it's Ranger. Let's move." The trail led them away from the tidy homes of Cedar Falls, out past the edges of town where fields gave, way to old industrial roads. The night was humid, the air thick with the smell of asphalt and summer weeds. Ranger moved with certainty, nose low, body weaving as he locked onto Gregg's scent. something sharp chemical clinging to his path. After nearly an hour, they reached a row of abandoned warehouses, their windows black squares against the moonlit sky. The structure stood like hollow giants, relics of businesses that had left decades earlier. Ranger stopped before one of the largest, his body rigid, a low growl humming from his chest. Michael scanned the building. Its corrugated metal siding was rusted, the padlock on its side door broken long ago, but fresh tire tracks scarred the dirt outside, too recent to be dismissed. "Looks like we found his hole," Sarah murmured. She drew her sidearm, her lean figure framed in the silver glow of the moon. Michael nodded, tightening his grip on Rares' harness. "Stay sharp." Inside, the air was stale with dust and oil. Their flashlights cut thin beams through the darkness, sweeping across broken pallets and long-forgotten machinery. Ranger led them, deeper, ears prick-ricked until they came to a smaller locked door within the warehouse. The dog pawed at it, furiously, barking once, the sound sharp and echoing. Michael forced the lock, shoulder slamming against the frame until it cracked. The door swung open, and the beam of his flashlight landed on a room that froze his breath. Along the walls stood small iron frame beds lined in 2 neat rows. Thin mattresses were covered with faded sheets, and stuffed animals lay discarded in the corners, their button eyes staring blankly. A shelf held bottles of liquid sedatives, half empty, their labels clinical and cold. In another corner were piles of children's clothes, shirts, dresses, tiny sneakers stacked like lost offerings. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic mixed with mildew, a place designed to erase innocence. Sarah's face hardened, her hazel eyes burning with fury. He's been preparing this, not just here, but probably in every town he's lived. Michael swallowed the bile, rising in his throat. He glanced down at Ranger, who stood motionless, ears angled forward, his gaze locked on something beyond. The shepherd pulled toward the back door. Outside, the night deepened, cicadas screaming in the fields. Emily's faint cry carried across the dark like a thin bell. Michael and Sarah froze, their flashlights cutting toward the sound. Emily was there, her small figure held tightly by Greg, who kept one arm around her chest, while the other pressed a knife against her side. Her carousel t-shirt was torn at the plain sleeve, her eyes wide with terror. Greg's hair was disheveled now, his shirt smeared with dirt. The polished charm was gone, replaced by a gaunt desperation, his sharp features twisted in the shadows, eyes wild. "Stay back," he snarled, his voice cracking. "She's mine now. You don't know what it costs to carry deadweight families, children, burdens that crush you. I've been the one to take it away, to make life easier for men too weak to admit they wanted freedom." Emily whimpered, clutching Mr. Bear tight against her chest, even as Greg's grip dug into her. Michael's voice was steady, calm as stone. "Greg, it's over. Let the girl go." Greg's laugh was jagged, echoing through the empty lot. "You think I haven't done this before? You think you can stop me now?" He jerked Emily closer, the knife flashing under the moonlight. Ranger growled, the sound low, vibrating through the ground. His body was tense, coiled like a spring. Then Greg lunged, knife hand flicking toward Michael as he shoved Emily aside. Ranger exploded forward, a streak of black and tan, against the silver night. He hit Greg full force, jaws clamping on the man's arm, teeth sinking until the knife clattered to the ground. Greg screamed, twisting, but the shepherd's weight drove him down, paws locking against his chest. Michael moved fast, kicking the knife further away, his hand closing on his cuffs. Greg thrashed, his face contorted with rage, but Ranger held firm, amber eyes blazing with protective fury. Sarah rushed to Emily, pulling her into her arms. The little girl shook, violently, burying her face into Sarah's shoulder. Sarah's lean frame bent protectively over her, whispering words. Emily was too shaken to hear. Michael pressed Greg's face into the dirt, cuffing him with practiced efficiency. "Greg Miller, you're under arrest." His voice carried no triumph, only the heavy finality of justice long overdue. Ranger released his grip on command, stepping back, but standing guard, his chest heaving, muzzle flecked with dirt and sweat. The warehouse loomed silent again, only the sounds of Emily's sobs and Greg's ragged breathing breaking the night. Michael rose, resting a hand on Rares' head, grounding himself in the shepherd's steady presence. It was over. For now. Greg lay cuffed. Emily clutched tightly in Sarah's arms, and Ranger stood tall against the darkness. The secret room, the broken mask, and the violent confrontation had ended here in the quiet outskirts of Cedar Falls. The courthouse in Columbus stood like a gray sentinel, tall columns framing its marble steps, a place where the weight of justice pressed on everyone who entered. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras flashing in the morning light. Families of missing children clutched one another, faces lined with grief and hope. Inside, the air was cooler, but no less heavy. The seal of the United States hung above the judge's bench, reminding all who entered that this was no small-town hearing. This was federal. Greg Miller sat at the defense table in a crisp suit, his dark hair slicked back, his expression strangely calm. Even in shackles, he wore a faint smile as though charm could still rescue him. His lean face, once quick with smiles and smooth words, was now drawn, tight, shadows beneath his eyes betraying sleepless nights. At the prosecution's table, Detective Sarah Langford leaned forward, eyes sharp as blades. She wore a charcoal blazer, auburn hair pinned back, her tall frame tense with restrained energy. For her, this was more than a case. It was the fight she had trained for all her life since losing her sister. Every word she passed to the prosecutor carried both evidence and personal fire. Michael Turner sat just behind, Ranger at his feet. The German shepherd's coat gleamed under the lights, his ears pricked, posture alert. He wasn't just a K9 today. He was witness, protector, and symbol of the truth that had brought this case into the open. The trial unfolded with devastating clarity. Federal prosecutors laid out the evidence. Bottles of opioid painkillers hidden in Greg's belongings. The photographs and files discovered in the garage. The testimony of other families from the states Greg had haunted like a shadow. A digital forensics agent. Daniel Ross, a wiry man in his 32nd with sandy hair and thin-rimmed glasses, testified about encrypted files pulled from Greg's laptop. His quiet, precise voice explained how money had flowed through false charities and adoption services, funds siphoned into shell and accounts. His pale skin flushed whenever he spoke quickly, but his calm confidence made the jury lean in. The charges piled higher. Poisoning a child, financial fraud, conspiracy, and human trafficking. Each word struck like a hammer. John Carter was called to the stand. He walked slowly, shoulders bent, his plaid shirt hanging loose on his frame. Weeks of guilt had aged him beyond his 38 years. His sandy hair was uncombed, his eyes red, rimmed. When he raised his right hand to swear the oath, his fingers trembled. "I thought he was. My friend," John said, voice breaking in the silence. "After my wife died, I couldn't handle everything." Greg stepped in. He cooked. He fixed things. He told me I was doing my best. I wanted to believe him. I didn't see. He stopped, pressing his hand against his face. "I almost lost my daughter because I was blind." The courtroom was still. Even the reporters lowered their pens for a moment. Emily was too young to testify, formally, but she was present. Sitting with a victim's advocate, she wore a pale yellow dress, her brown hair braided neatly. She still clutched Mr. Bear, his torn ear stitched now with bright red thread by Nurse Linda. When the recess bell rang and the tension eased briefly, Emily slipped from her chair and walked over to Ranger. She threw her thin arms around his thick neck, pressing her cheek into his fur. Her voice was small, but carried enough to reach Michael's ears. "You heard me," she whispered. "When no one else did, you heard the scream in my tummy." Ranger lowered his head, leaning gently into her, amber eyes soft. Michael swallowed the lump in his throat. He had worn a badge long enough to know that victories in court rarely healed wounds. But watching Emily bury her fear in the warmth of his partner, he understood something deeper. Ranger had saved more than Emily's life. He had restored her belief that someone would always listen. Greg's defense tried, but their words rang hollow. They painted him as a misunderstood man, a wanderer with bad luck, accused unfairly. But every piece of evidence, every witness tore holes through the facade. RER's reaction to his belongings, Emily's whispered testimony to doctors, the records of missing children, all pointed back to him. When the jury returned, the foreman, a gray-haired woman with stern features, read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The room exhaled as if it had held its breath for days. Greg's smile, once smug, vanished at last, replaced by a hollow stare that told the world his power was gone. Weeks later, Cedar Falls wore summer light like a healing balm. The town breathed again, though still carrying scars. Emily's laughter began to return in fragments, fragile yet radiant, as she chased butterflies across the park. Ranger padded close, his shadow never straying far. To the community, he was a decorated hero, but to Emily, he was something deeper: family, the heartbeat she trusted when every other sound had betrayed her. John worked quietly to mend what had been broken. He rebuilt his home one wall at a time, and more importantly, one promise at a time. He stumbled over recipes, burned toast, and awkwardly read bedtime stories, but Emily held onto his hand tighter than ever. His guilt never disappeared. It lingered like a scar, but instead of destroying him, it became his compass. Sarah Langford visited sometimes. She never spoke of her sister. Yet Michael saw the way her hazel eyes softened when she watched Emily laugh, the rigid edges of her frame melting in Ranger's presence. Justice had not erased her grief, but it had given her something like peace. Michael himself often sat on his porch at dusk. Ranger stretched at his feet, cicadas humming in the trees. He thought of Emily's words whispered in court, "You heard me." He carried them like a badge of truth, a reminder that justice isn't always in verdicts or evidence, but in the moment, a child finally feels safe enough to breathe again. The Carter home was no longer a house of shadows. It was rebuilt in trust, in love, in the steady rhythm of a German shepherd's watchful heart. And for Emily, John, Michael, and Ranger, the story did not end in fear. It began again in fragile light that kept growing stronger. Yet Cedar Falls would never forget. Months later, when townsfolk spoke of that yellow house with the white fence, they lowered their voices. Not because of the darkness it once held, but because of the miracle it revealed, that even in silence, a cry for help can find its way to ears that will not ignore it. And perhaps that was the greater lesson. Miracles are not always thunderous. Sometimes they come in the bark of a loyal dog, the courage of a trembling child, or the steady hands of those who choose to listen when the world looks away. But on one late summer evening, as Emily slept peacefully and Ranger stirred suddenly from his dreams, Michael noticed it, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the fence. The night was quiet, too quiet. For just a moment, Michael wondered if the shadows of Cedar Falls were truly gone, or if another secret still waited to be uncovered.